Hey, so I will be probably making a number of videos on this Tory leadership race because it's going to have a lot of nuances and a lot of angles to look at. I may or may not make videos on the individual candidates depending how things go. Probably by this time next week it will narrow down. 10 candidates now, that's a record. There were 11, but Sam Gimya dropped out, but I think that's a record, at least in modern times. It's like the Democratic race for US president. A lot of candidates in the field. Anyway, I want to talk about some general social issues connected with this. Um, and I'm not talking so much about policy area, although that's going to come into it, but more about, I guess, philosophy and attitudes. Apparently, Boris Johnson is thinking about raising the rate of income tax from 50,000 to 80,000. In other words, he's going to consider 80,000 as the well off, um, to be taxed the higher rate of income as opposed to 50,000. Now, 50,000 is a pretty comfortable salary. It's not super rich, but it's pretty comfortable. Um, and I think a lot of people will look at this, with raised eyebrows. Um, why should someone on 50,000 get a tax break? I don't think that 50,000 is super rich. It certainly isn't. But compared to most people, it is a pretty comfortable salary. Um, there is an image problem here, and free market economists of conservative persuasion would find a lot of ways to justify Johnson's position. I was listening with interest to the dialogue on this on LBC. Um, but I think there is fundamentally an image problem with the Tories that they still haven't really got over. And it is that they are a party of the rich, for the rich, by the rich. I don't actually think this is entirely the case. Obviously, there are many middle class Tories and there are many working class Tories as well, people who vote Tory, and there are members of the Conservative Party who are for working class roots. Um, and I don't think it's a prerequisite that if you're working class, you need to be socialist or vote Labour. I certainly don't think that's a given. Just like if you are well off, it's not predestined that you need to be a conservative. The late Tony Benn was born into aristocracy, but he was a lifelong socialist. So Bertrand Russell as well. Um, but there is an aspect of Tory thinking, or maybe not Tory, maybe I'll rephrase that. Not necessarily party political Tory, but conservative thinking that I really take issue with. And it's what I would call survival of the fittest. I think conservatives have this idea, and it's true, that if business does well, that's good for an economy, and it certainly is true. But I have a big problem with people who look down on those on the margins of society for whatever reason, like they perceive the problems that those people face to be of their own making, and sometimes they are. There's legitimate issues to be raised there. I'll get into that in a minute, but they are either apathetic to or deliberately supportive of crony capitalism and the privilege of super wealth. I mean, if you are angry about welfare and people abusing the welfare system, but you have no feelings about undeserved banking bonuses, then your moral compass isn't consistent. It isn't consistent. And I'm saying this as someone who I don't call myself a socialist. I would consider myself centre right on a number of positions. But when it comes to the wealth poverty gap, I'm no communist. I don't believe in redistributing wealth in the sense of, you know, forcing businesses to self shame and all that sort of stuff. The sort of things that went on in Mao's China, which were horrendous. But I think there are certain people who are born into privilege, who are privileged. Maybe they even come from working class backgrounds, but they've worked hard and they're now in a position where they've done well for themselves, but they then actually get a very cynical attitude to others. I mean, actually, some of the most hardline Tories are from working class backgrounds. Something I've noticed. Um, Quite often, those born into privilege are not that political. It's often those. I mean, Margaret Thatcher was no blue blood in the sense that she didn't come from ivory towers. She came from a pretty modest middle class background. Um, Yet in her tenure, the rich got richer. Um, it's just a track record under Tory governments, and it's irrefutable. Under this Tory government, the rate of homelessness has risen. These are just facts. I mean, this isn't some sort of far left propaganda, it's just verifiable facts. And I have a big problem with saying that it's okay to vilify the poorest, but then when the anger goes the other way and the rich get vilified. Oh well, that's terrible. I don't think anyone should be vilified for. I mean, I don't think all rich people are bad people. There's a lot of rich people who are also very benevolent. They do a lot for charity, and quite often they want to be anonymous because they don't want to promote it. They don't want to make that a thing. I totally get that. So that's where I disagree with socialists. There are some socialists who think that all rich people are bad. That's not true. That's not fair. But I have a big problem with people who never have to worry about money. They never have financial anxiety. They never know what that is like. The audacity that some of them have to look down on the unemployed or the homeless or anyone else who is struggling, I think that is disgusting. It's not a case that I think they should sort of have to make quotas of how much to give to charity or something like that. I think it's very much their money; they could do what they want with it. But there is something fundamentally rotten about someone who is well off and has that sort of attitude to people who are struggling. I'm not talking about someone who's well off and has conservative views necessarily about tax or about other things, but there is something fundamentally rotten about someone who doesn't know what it's like to struggle and yet looks down on those who do in a generalized sense. I mean, regarding welfare, I know there's people who abuse the system, but if you are super rich, you're not the person to be pontificating about that. I mean, you yourself may not be corrupt. But the point is, if you're going to attack claimants because they may have claimed more than they should have, but you're going to turn a blind eye to the super rich, getting these overseas tax havens to escape the tax system here, or top bankers who get massive undeserved bonuses at the height of the Great Recession. If you're okay with those things, to me, that's just sheer moral hypocrisy. I think where socialists are wrong is they're against wealth in general. They think that all wealth is bad and that the way to go about things is to redistribute everything. I don't believe that's the right way, but I'm also skeptical of trickle down wealth. I'm no economist. I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert in this area. I'm not. I still need to inform myself about a lot of things. I'm talking here purely about an emotional response to some of the attitudes I see. I'll give an example. Georgia Tofolo, now, she's not a heavyweight politician. She's not even a politician, but she's a young conservative. She's only 24, 25, reality TV star. She's never struggled a day in her life. She's a typical spoilt rich kid. Yet the attitude that she has about, for example, the unemployed is sickening. I don't mind saying that. And she's, an open conservative supporter. This is the sort of people that give the Tories a bad image. And I think there are decent conservatives out there who know there is an image problem, just as there will be decent Labour people who don't like this image problem that Labour has of being a dictator supporting terrorist sympathising. Um, that's the image of the current leadership, and there is basis to that, verifiable basis. It's not just tabloid smears. These are verifiable things. Um, Everyone wants to be in a position where they are at least comfortable, if not rich, at least comfortable. But I just find it sickening that there are people who are doing well for themselves, and maybe it's because they've worked hard for it, fine. I don't begrudge them that. But it sickens me that they think it's okay to vilify people who are struggling in a generalized sense. If they were saying, I don't like that some people abuse the system, but I understand it's not everyone, and I understand being unemployed is difficult. Okay, that's a reasonable, balanced opinion. But if they're just saying, oh, the unemployed are lazy dole scroungers, I say that's inflammatory, ignorant nonsense. And idiots like Georgia Tofolo, you know, I've no respect for people like that. And self respecting Tories would do well to distance themselves from people like her. It's times like this when I see attitudes like hers, I guess I am more inclined towards the left. And sometimes, don't quote me on this because I'm very skeptical of many aspects of Corbyn's leadership and of Jeremy Corbyn himself. But very, very occasionally, I almost wonder what would be like to have a pretty left wing government. I probably wouldn't vote for it, but I sometimes think, well, the Tories have had 9 years now in government. New Labour moved to the centre. So we haven't really had an authentically left government for a very long time. Certainly not at least since Harold Wilson's days. So sometimes I think maybe give Corbyn a chance. How much can he mess up? I mean, like I said, I have serious reservations about Corbyn, particularly on issues of national security um, and basic patriotism. But when it comes to social justice, I think the Tories have a long way to go to really show that they are all about the big society. I mean, how can they really say that they're a party of fairness when they're demonizing claimants and yet turning a blind eye to um, the likes of Mike Ashley at JD Sports? Sure, he was grilled by a parliamentary committee, but why do Tories not talk about the likes of him using the same sort of language that they use about claimants? Surely this is a reasonable question. That's not a far left position. It's a reasonable proposition to expect some sort of consistency. So if the Tories are all about fair play and justice, then they really need to prove it by speaking out against the privilege of wealth. But I think a lot of Tories, MPs and members, admire financial success. So they will always put a caveat to it. Like they'll always go far easier on a multimillionaire who's abused his or her position than a claimant who has claimed a bit too much from the system, even though it'll be a microcosm of what the millionaire does. And some people will say I'm playing class warfare here or something like that. I don't consider myself a raging socialist. I'm not. I think business is a good thing. I've thought myself about getting into business. But this is a party that opposes the minimum wage, and you have to really dig a little bit beneath the surface there. There's something fundamentally wrong with someone who thinks that, or with the mentality of opposing someone getting a fair wage for work, for labor, for putting in a service, that they would have a problem with that. And yet they've got no problem with top bankers getting massive bonuses at the height of the Great Recession. I mean, the Tories were muted in their criticism of that, yet it really enraged a significant portion of the public, including myself. I don't mind admitting I was disgusted by it. The United Kingdom has one of the biggest wealth poverty gaps among all developed countries. That's not something to be proud of. It's something we really need to work on. I'm not saying I've got the magic wand, I'm not an economist, but it's something that we need to work on. And I think the Tories, I mean, the next Prime Minister is going to be a Conservative, and unless there's a general election, it's going to be a Tory government for a while. I think even with a general election, there's many people who have serious reservations about Jeremy Corbyn. But I want to see a Tory leader who is prepared to admit some of the problems that the party has. Theresa May actually got a lot of slack when she said we are seen as the nasty party. But she was right. They were. And she was right to recognise that they needed to change their image. How much have they done so? I don't know. Now, when Tories are pushing this, they will always say, oh, we're not interested in the super rich. We want to help the middle class. The middle class. This is the big thing. And that's fine. But I really have a big problem with the sort of populism of scapegoating the unemployed. You know, these cynical sort of campaign slogans like strivers versus scroungers. And yet there's enormous hypocrisy when you look at some Tory MPs themselves, the sort of benefits that they get. So I think when we talk about fairness in society, every angle needs to be looked at. And those people, I'm not just talking about Tory MPs or even Tory members, anyone who is looking at those who are on the margins of society, the homeless, the unemployed, etc. I'm not saying they can't be criticised. I'm not saying that, anyone is above criticism, but if you're vilifying those people, at least be consistent and at least look at the extremes on the top end of the scale. I think a lot of Tory supporters and people who are really hardline capitalist, they look up to wealth, so they don't want to criticize the wealthy ever. And I think that's something fundamentally wrong with that.